Shalom lekulam. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us on this evening. I'm sure the strike helped some people come and arrive, and we're happy for that. We're going to get started. So we are very excited to have Isabella Weber, who is an assistant professor of economics at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. Her first book, How China Escaped Shock Therapy, The Market Reform Debate, was the winner of the Joan Robinson Prize, shout out for Joan Robinson, 2021, and the International Studies Association Best Interdisciplinary Book Award. That's a very long-sounding award. It has been recommended on Best Book of 2021 lists by the Financial Times, Foreign Policy, Project Syndicate, ProMarket, and a lot more. She is the principal investigator of a research on inflation and profits funded by the Groundwork Collaborative, which is a wonderful organization I'm also a little affiliated with. I recommend you check it out. Her writings have appeared in the Washington Post. This is old. I'm sure it's much many more publications since then, but her writings have appeared in the Washington Post, The Guardian, Forbes, and Project Syndicate. She holds a PhD in economics from the New School for Social Research and a PhD in developmental studies from the University of Cambridge. 5 years ago, with Ronen, Erez, Roni, and Michal, who can't be with us today, we founded a interdisciplinary, inter-university workshop on the political economy of neoliberalism. And after 5 years of doing kind of workshops with mostly young scholars here in Israel, we decided it was time to have an international event. And we were thinking of who would we want to be our keynote speaker. And the top of our list for everyone was Isabella Weber. I think in many ways she encompasses much of what we are trying to do in this workshop. Her work is often historical, but it's always engaged in present problems. It deals with economic thought, but it's always also materialist. It is quantitative and empirical, but never loses sight of the politics. It has a strong theoretical base, but is not wedded to one-size-fits-all abstracted models. And most importantly, she drives some libertarians crazy, and that was... Yeah. The book, which I really recommend that you read, and I can tell you as someone who did a PhD at Harvard in history of economic thought, reading the first chapters of that book, I realized, how ethnocentric still the study of economic and the history of economic thought is, and just what an incredible addition it is to learn about the history of Chinese thought. And they don't have the same false dichotomies between state and market that we often fall into even today. But anyway, reading the book, which I do really recommend, it's all about the history of price controls and debates, fights, arguments over whether there should be price controls or not. And I don't know many people, and these debates were also taking place during times of inflation, oftentimes, during times of rapid and unstable change, during times of emergency. And I really don't know anyone like this who wrote a history book, and then that history came to life, and it came to life very personally. For those who don't know, Isabella wrote an excellent article in The Guardian about a year ago where she kind of took a lot of the ideas that she had written in her book about the importance of targeted, strategic price controls in these moments of emergency. And a certain Nobel laureate and a few other economists went kind of crazy. But I think in the end, the fact that a few months later she was invited by the German government to actually institute these very ideas of price controls is, I think, the ultimate example that we're living in very interesting times. And I think if we are entering a post-neoliberal moment, it will be because of economists like you. At the University of Chicago, someone gave a test a few weeks after this Twitter event happened. I'm going to read the question. It was worth 2 points on the exam. An economist at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, Bernie's favorite institution of higher education, wrote an op-ed column on December 30th arguing that to tackle our current 40-year high bout with rising price levels, we have a powerful weapon to fight inflation, price controls. And then the economist asked, how would a real economist respond? Well, I can tell you this is what real economists look like. And I think if you read Isabella's book, she can also show you that there were periods where radical left-wing economists like Irving Fisher and Paul Samuelson and Frank Knight and Simon Kuznets, they also understood that in times of emergency, and maybe also in other eras, we shouldn't just kind of like, bow to the gods of the free market. And so thank you so much, Isabella, to coming today. And it's really an honor to host you and have you here. It's been wonderful. And please, the floor is yours. And thank you very much to the Van Leer Institute for hosting us and for the Buber for helping us with this conference. We couldn't have done it without you. And my other organizers, Erez Magor, Ronen Mendelkern. Where's Roni? I don't see her. There's Roni. And Roni here. Thank you so much for coming.
How to start a talk after this? I certainly don't know. Let me start by thanking you. Thanking you. Thank you, Eli, for this amazing introduction, but most importantly for inviting me and for giving me an opportunity to be here today. And thanks to the whole committee, you really have been giving me such an incredible warm welcome, and I'm thrilled to be here. I've also heard that there are some people in the audience who haven't been to an in-person event in 5 years, so I feel even more anxious trying to satisfy their intellectual desire of being in the room here. The title of this workshop or conference is Neoliberal Capitalism Between Crisis and Resilience. And I think that the whole inflation debate is also one where the current paradigm is really somewhere in between crisis and resilience. On the one hand, the current paradigm is somehow shaking, like new ideas are popping up, they are getting a lot of traction in ways that is a kind of poking holes into something that used to be thought rock solid. There are studies coming out by institutions that are quite unlikely to be part of a paradigm shifting momentum, such as the Société Générale or the UBS or BlackRock, or increasingly even central banks like the European Central Bank, the Bank of England calling on corporations to please stop hiking prices, and so on. The University of Chicago, to the best of my knowledge, has not yet changed their exam question, but I'm waiting for that to happen. So this brings me to the point of resilience. Yes, indeed, the current paradigm might be shaking. There might be holes emerging, but I think it is very much resilient, since at the end of the day, even though in terms of the analysis of the inflation, there might be new views at least being heard, not necessarily being dominant, but at least starting to be heard. I think in terms of the policy response to the inflation, we are very much within the old playbook, despite the emergency measures that, of course, have been taken in Europe last year, really as a result of absolute emergencies. In the German case, I would say they walked to the very edge of the cliff and then decided that they should not take another step, but they did look into the abyss. So in that sense, I think we are in some sort of an in-between moment. And the humble, unreal economist standing right in front of you here has, for really more or less random biographical reasons, acquired a voice in this in-between moment. So the title of my presentation today is Inflation in Times of Overlapping Emergencies, Systemically Significant Prices, Profits, and Conflict. And I will focus on my recent research on US inflation, but I wanted to start by kind of giving you a sense of where I'm coming from intellectually, since it has been a rather unlikely kind of trajectory. And I think that this trajectory is very much interrelated with the topic of this conference, with the history of neoliberalism, with China's battles with the neoliberal paradigm. The title of my book, which was published on the 29th of May 2021, is How China Escaped Shock Therapy, the Market Reform Debate. I am highlighting the publication date here because this was the year when inflation started to take off, right? And I was sitting in front of my computer in the woods of Western Mass with an occasional black bear crossing in front of my window, giving talks about inflation in times of sudden rupture. the book is primarily about the crossroads of the 1980s, which I'm thinking of as a crossroads in the sense that it marks the convergence of the economic might of China in the global economy with the West, but also a divergence of the fates of the two former giants of socialism, namely Russia and China, which I think has all to do with the market reform paradigm that they chose, and also with the ways in which they have handled the question of inflation and the challenge of price stability. So this is a story of China's escape from shock therapy. It's a story of something that has not been done in the end, but was very much on the table, which raises the question of what was that thing that was on the table and why did they not do it? The challenge at the beginning of the reform era in the late 1970s, I think, was really the question of how to introduce markets into a formally planned command economy. So I'm arguing that, yes, there were conservatives who were entirely opposed to markets altogether and from the outset, but that the fiercest reform debate was within the market reform camp, who were grappling with the question of how to introduce market mechanisms into the system that they inherited. Now, this is a depiction of the system that they inherited. It's clearly an ideal type depiction. It clearly misses a lot of nuances. It clearly is not a good map of the Maoist economy in the year 1980. But I'm trying to bring out certain basic characteristics, which is that the individual production units in the system did not take production decisions independently responding to price signals, but rather they were responding to commands from higher up levels, and the inputs were allocated to them as part of the plan. Now, on the surface, we might think that this means that prices had no role at all in the system. They were just an accounting operation, just a shadow operation. As a matter of fact, the communists used the price system as a system of redistribution, which meant that they set the prices of the most essential, the most important stuff pretty low, and the stuff of the not so essential, quote-unquote luxury goods, think of luxurious goods like a very simple wristwatch, or luxurious goods like a very simple kind of bike, or luxurious goods like a simple little radio, that would be very expensive. So the expensive consumer goods had the function of extracting liquidity from households, and the low input prices at the beginning of the value chain were meant to encourage industrialization. So the question then is, like, how do you introduce market prices into a system like this? What happened more or less spontaneously was the emergence of a second track within the system, of a market track within the system. To some extent, markets might have existed during the Maoist period in like hidden areas of the economy. So in that sense, there might have been more continuity than we would think if we just focus on the ideal type depiction that I gave you on the first slide. But in any case, the agricultural reforms, which introduced markets into the agricultural sphere, meant that people in the countryside now were generating cash incomes, and they were using these cash incomes to buy consumer goods from the urban industry economy, which created a new kind of market demand for these kind of goods, but also created a new demand for the upstream type of stuff, so that you got more or less endogenously a market emerging at the periphery of the old urban industrial system as a result of the agricultural reforms. So the big debate then amongst Chinese economists was whether this is a totally distorted kind of system that is worse than the previous system, because now you have a market track and you have a plant track and you actually have multiple prices. What could be worse than having more than one price signal? So that system was considered by some as an even less desirable system than the pre-reform system. Others were arguing that this second track was a way to marketize without destroying the economy that they inherited. So those who criticized the dual-track system were arguing that there was a need for a big bang. In the first step, China should adjust all prices based on calculations to come up with a rational price system, unify the two tracks, then impose macroeconomic austerity, and then let go of all controls in one big bang. And in particular, let go of the most important, most essential kind of prices, which is basically the shock therapy recipe, at least as regards the price liberalization element of shock therapy. And even the most committed shock therapists would argue that the big bang in price reform is the most important element in shock therapy. In China, those who were in favor of the dual-track system critiqued the proposal of a Big Bang in the 1980s, so long before this kind of policy was implemented in Russia, long before this policy had created hyperinflation, at least in some cases where it was implemented, had created recessions that were not only very deep but also very prolonged. And they were arguing that a Big Bang would, by design, lead to the most important prices shooting up because they were initially set too low, so clearly they would have to shoot up if you were to liberalize them. And because of the setup of the institutions in a planned command economy, the production units would not adjust their technologies to these higher prices, but they would simply hand down the price increases to the respective next production unit until eventually retail prices would be going up, until eventually wage earners would be claiming higher wages, at which point you would have a cost-push inflation that has given rise to a wage price spiral. And they added that this kind of micro-driven inflation could not be contained by macro control in the Chinese setting of the 1980s, because China at the time didn't even really have a functioning central bank. They didn't even really have the kind of instruments of macro control that we have established in the West. So they were arguing this was not an option. China, in the end, escaped the Big Bang, but it's important to keep in mind that the core of the debate was not so much whether to let go of the prices of inessential consumer goods. The stuff downstream, the wristwatches, the radios, and the bicycles, which had very high prices, were therefore very profitable, were also light industry goods that could be relatively easily adjusted in terms of the scope of production. But the core of the debate was whether or not to liberalize in one big bang the essential goods, stuff like coal, steel, copper, various other sources of energy that started to be used at the time. So this was really a question of whether or not the state should keep being involved, being a participant in the markets for the essential stuff for industries. Okay, this is kind of the 5-minute summary of my book. Now, we are jumping forward into the year 2020, 2021. And I think it's, so I cannot speak for the Israeli context. I'm definitely not speaking for the global south at large. But I think it's fair to say that in most rich countries, inflation was something that economists didn't think about actively anymore. It was something that you studied in the textbook as like a hypothetical thing that sometimes happened in the 1970s and that can occur in your macro model, but that was not part of what people really were grappling with intellectually. So I think that in the Great Moderation, a vision of price stabilization had become common sense that I'm characterizing with this kind of coin-fueled horse. I have no idea whether in Israel or in whatever country you might have come to this conference from, you also had these kind of horses in front of your supermarkets or shopping malls. I can attest to the fact that in the 1990s in Germany we did have these kind of horses. And I remember them as being pretty boring, but in any case they still had this appeal that you wanted to sit on them, so that you ended up putting some money in them. But anyways, so the basic mechanism of this kind of horse is very obvious, right? You kind of know exactly the range of motion of the horse, It's completely one-dimensional. It's not one of these like fancy horses that does this, but it's like just doing this, right? You know exactly like at which point it's going to turn back and at which point it's going to turn forward again. And I mean, if you had an opportunity to disassemble this machine, you would also have a very clear sense of what are the mechanisms that are making this go forward or go backward. Which might be a good enough approximation of the problem of price stability if you are in a situation without major shocks, without large, sudden structural shifts, without big bottlenecks, without extreme emergencies. So it might have worked just fine for the Great Moderation. What is underpinning this vision of inflation is either that it's a monetary phenomenon, if you take a monetarist view, and if we go back to the 1970s and look at what Milton Friedman had to say about inflation, I think the following quote is really useful in seeing how his vision of inflation is different from the one that is emerging as at least a commonsensical part of the story that we are dealing with today. So Friedman was writing in 1974, "What of oil and food, to which every government official has pointed? Are they not the obvious immediate cause of the price explosion? Not at all. It is essential to distinguish changes in relative prices from changes in absolute prices. The special conditions that drove up the prices of oil and food required purchasers to spend more on them, leaving less to spend on other items. Did that not force other prices to go down or to rise less rapidly than otherwise? Why should the average level of oil prices be affected significantly by changes in the prices of some things relative to others?" So in other words, if one price shoots up, people will have less money in their pocket if they choose to continue to buy that thing, which would mean that they would spend less on other items, which would mean that the prices of this other stuff would go down, which would mean that on average, the price level should not be moving because of the movement of one specific price. Which also means that prices are basically only connected through the budget constraints of individuals, which is the mechanism that contains these relative prices from becoming the driving force of inflation. From a more new Keynesian perspective, we wouldn't focus as much on the monetary perspective, but we would still say that inflation is basically something that originates from the macro level, from the level of the economy as a whole. So inflation would here take off when aggregate demand goes beyond full capacity utilization. So we have some sort of an idea of thinking of the economy as a whole as if it was an individual market, where we have aggregate demand, which resembles all of the demand in the whole economy, and we have, on the other hand, the capacity utilization, which basically creates a homogeneous idea of all the things in the economy that can create supply. In this kind of setup, one would typically acknowledge that relative price changes can create transitory adjustments, but do not have any lasting bearing on macroeconomic outcomes, except for some special cases. Some new Keynesians, like for example Blinder, would add, where in the 1970s the oil, food, and mortgage rates actually did matter. There's also literature on stochastic analysis of distribution of changes in relative prices, but which is again concerned with the stochastic distribution and not with the role of specific prices. So I would argue that from this perspective too, you would assume that specific price shocks are at best transitory in their relationship to inflation, and that in fact it's no coincidence that in the year 2021 we basically had a confrontation between those who were in favor of hiking interest rates more or less immediately and those who were saying, oh, it's transitory because these relative price adjustments will work out sooner or later, so therefore we should not be worrying. It's not really a macroeconomic issue. Now, what I'm arguing in my paper, which is co-authored with three other people, one is my PhD student, two co-authors from Brazil, is that in times of overlapping emergencies, where climate change is a reality, extreme weather events are a reality, the pandemic is unfortunately not over, the global economic order, I think, is more more and more crumbling, or at least the institutions that used to create a certain degree of stability in a world that, whether you like it or not, is a world of deeply coupled economies, that in such a world, we should start to think about inflation more like riding an actual horse, where, I don't know how many of you equestrians. I did not have the privilege of learning how to ride a horse when I was a child, and after I became a professor in New England, I thought this was, and I was living through a global pandemic, I thought this was a final moment for me to catch up on that lack of cultural capital, but also to just have some fun in an environment that looks pretty much like in this picture. So if you are riding an actual horse, you will never be able to control everything around you, right? It's impossible. But you can know certain things that trigger your horse, right? So for example, if you go on a trail ride, and there's a biker on a, I mean, not on a motorbike, but on a bike that passes by, you want this person to talk to you and say, hi, how are you? So that the person on the bike uses their voice and identifies themselves as a human being, so that the horse can recognize, oh, this is a human being and not a monster made out of steel, so I'm fine, I don't have to do what the horse is doing in this picture, right? So what I'm arguing is that in order to understand and handle price stability in an age where shocks are becoming systemic, we need to understand the trigger points in terms of specific sectors that have the potential to unleash macroeconomic stability. So I'm not ruling out that there can be macroeconomic stability that resides from macroeconomic dimensions. That would be absurd. But I'm saying beyond macroeconomic origins, there are also micro and mesoeconomic origins of inflation, and we have to understand what the trigger points are. We will never be perfect in understanding them, just like with the real horse, but we can be prepared and we can be better at understanding them if we start asking these questions. So to shift the perspective in that way, I'm proposing to revive Wassily Leontiev, who was perceiving of the economy as a circular flow of inputs and outputs, where prices are no longer just connected through individual budget constraints, but are connected because one sector's output is another sector's input, and therefore one sector's output is another sector's, one sector's output price is another sector's input price, so therefore there's a systemic relationship between individual prices. Or in Leontiev's own words, input-output analysis is a method of systemically quantifying the mutual interrelationships among the various sectors of a complex economic system. The effect of an event at any one point is transmitted to the rest of the economy step by step via the chain of transactions that links the whole system together. Far from being independent of each other, the cost-price structures of all the separate industries are nothing but links in a vast network which embraces the whole national economy. Overall dependence among wage rates, profits earned, and taxes paid per unit of output in each of the many sectors, in each of the many separate industries on the one hand, and the prices of all different kinds of goods and services sold by these industries on the other. Now, if we perceive of the economy as such a circular flow, as such an interconnected network, then we can start asking the questions of what are the critical knots in this network that if something happens to these knots, it will have very large effects in the network as a whole. In fact, Leontiev, I think somewhat provocatively, opposed Milton Friedman by making the exact opposite statement. So in 1974, he was arguing, as a matter of fact, the problem of inflation cannot be dealt with in aggregative terms either. So here he was actually also quite explicitly opposed to the Keynesians. So in that sense, Leontiev is sitting like somewhat uncomfortably with both the Keynesians and the neoliberals in the 70s. If you had inflation in which all prices and incomes move in parallel, nobody would care. Actual inflation is a change in relative prices, not just in the average price level. Now, I would add to this, I mean, I'm having this here as kind of a provocative counterpoint to Milton Friedman. I wouldn't subscribe to this in its entirety. I think that there can be macroeconomic origins of inflation, and even if incomes and prices were to be moving in parallel, you can have asset price inflation, which is actually something that should be very familiar to all of us after having gone through a long period of quantitative easing in asset bubbles, in fun things like cryptocurrencies. So if we were to purely subscribe to that view, we would be missing that part of the story. But I'm thinking it's a helpful counterpoint to start trying to think about an alternative way of conceptualizing inflation. So the research question that we are then addressing in this first paper that we put out is, if inflation is not always and everywhere a macroeconomic phenomenon, so again, I'm not saying it cannot be a macroeconomic phenomenon, I'm just saying it's not always and everywhere a purely macroeconomic phenomenon, but can be unleashed by micro shocks on the supply side, we need to identify which sectors present points of vulnerability for monetary stability, or in other words, have the greatest potential to become systemically significant for inflation. So in some sense, this is also taking lessons from the banking crisis and the financial crisis, where we did move towards saying some things are systemically significant, some banks are too interconnected to fail, too big to fail, and those banks have to be regulated and treated in a different way. So we are using this same idea and bringing it to the real economy, connecting it with the idea of monetary stability. And here we are actually drawing, for example, on the work of Saule Omarova, who might be familiar to some of you. So what we do is that we construct a Leontief price model. I have decided to not put any equations into this presentation because I appreciate that this is an interdisciplinary audience, and I thought it would be better to have some time in the Q&A to try to discuss the nuts and bolts of these ideas rather than to take 15 minutes walking you through my equations. But if anyone is interested in the formal model, the working paper under the title Inflation in Times of Overlapping Emergencies is freely available on the internet, so everybody can dig into this. So what we do in this Leontief price model is that we simulate price shocks. We have 72 sectors, which is the number of sectors in the US input-output tables. And we shock each of these sectors one at a time. So every shock is basically its own model because we set that sector exogenously, make its price go up, and then assume that all the other sectors are reacting to this price shock by increasing their prices in passing on the cost increase. This is the first version of the model. We then choose different empirical magnitudes for these price shocks, where the first magnitude that we use is the price volatility before the pandemic, so the 20 years before the pandemic, by how much did prices on average move, and this average movement would be the magnitude of the shock. The second magnitude of the shock is the price movements that actually happened in the context of the post-shutdown inflation, so the annual price change to the fourth quarter of 2021. And then the third magnitude of the shock would be the second quarter of 2022, which this was the latest data that we had, which would include the beginning of the war in Ukraine. And we are thinking of the first kind of shock as trying to identify some sort of a latent systemic significance in the sense of using this data for normal times, and of the other two shocks as some sort of a realized systemic significance because we are using the data when actual shocks, large shocks were happening. This slide is designed for you to not be able to read it, courtesy of your presenter, because I want you to focus on the shape of the distribution in the first place. So each of these bars represents the total inflation impact that we get from these individual shocks, where the yellow part is the direct effect, that is the change in the CPI that is directly happening if you change the price of this sector. And the purple part is the indirect effect that we get through our model. And the green dots that you may or may not be able to see is the magnitude of the shocks based on the logic that I have just explained to you. So I think the first thing that sticks out here is that some industries matter much more than others for overall price stability, because we have the exact same setup, exact same assumptions for each of these simulations, but the distribution is very unequal, and there's nothing in the model that makes this unequal because each of them is a separate simulation. So in principle, each of these bars could have been identical, right? Now, if we zoom in, we find that in terms of the top ranks of industries that matter, which we call latent systemically significant, we have 8 industries that also show up again and again in all the other simulations that we do. And we haven't only altered the magnitude of the shock, we have also altered the magnitude of the transmission, which I can speak to later if this is of interest. And these sectors are petroleum and coal products, which by a very far margin are always the most important one. Oil and gas extraction, I mean, these 2 sectors are like very, very saliently important. Then farms, food and beverage and tobacco products, chemical products, housing, utilities, and wholesale trade. Now, this would be up to Q4 in 2021. So you see again, it's petroleum and coal products, oil and gas extraction, wholesale trade, chemical products, utilities, food and beverage, housing, farms, other retail, which is kind of a basket case. So the only new one that we have here is motor vehicles and parts dealers, which is kind of a very idiosyncratic issue that emerges in the pandemic. If we move into the second quarter of 2022, there's one new sector that is popping up here, which is truck transportation, which has to do with the coincidence of the very high fuel prices and the trucker shortage in the United States. This is a chart that plots the number of forward linkages on the horizontal axis, which is a measure of capturing the importance of an industry as an input to all other industries. And on the vertical axis, the average price movement of these sectors from 2000 to 2019. And I have highlighted in purple the industries that showed up as being important again and again. And basically what we can see is that some industries are rendered systemically important because they are just so upstream. They just have so many forward linkages, as in the case of wholesale trade. These gray lines are indicating the average. So anything that is to the right of the average line of forward linkages would have above average forward linkages. Everything that is above the horizontal line would have above average price movements. At the other end of the spectrum is housing, which is not an input into anything in the ways in which the housing sector is constructed. It also doesn't have a very high price volatility, but it's so important because it has such a high weight in the CPI. And then there are industries that are kind of in the middle that are important both because they have high numbers of forward linkages as well as because they have relatively high price volatility, such as farms, food, utilities, and chemical products. And oil and gas extraction and petroleum and coal products are actually, I mean, they are above average in terms of their forward linkages. I would have expected them to be even more to the right, but they have historically had very volatile prices, which is something that we know empirically, right? So therefore, there's something inherently volatile in the prices in these markets, which again contributes to their systemic significance. If we think about this in more intuitive terms, I think we can say that there are basically 3 groups of systemically significant sectors. The first one is basic necessities for people's livelihoods. So this is housing, farms, utilities, petroleum and gas products. The second is basic production inputs, so kind of the bread and butter stuff of industry, which is petroleum and gas products, oil and gas extraction, but also chemical products, which is something that I did not think about in relationship to inflation before doing this research. And then kind of the basic infrastructure of the circulation of goods, which is wholesale trade, and then truck transportation as a more idiosyncratic example. Okay, this is wrapping up the first paper on inflation, where, as I said, we have tried to, through these simulation exercises, get a first empirical handle at sectors that might matter more for price stability than others. I'm not saying this is the last word on this. We only have 72 sectors. We would want to become much more granular. Ideally, we would have some sort of firm-level networks and so on. But I think it's a first step to kind of prove a concept of trying to come up with ways of linking sector-level price movements with movements in the general price level. The second paper, which to my great surprise has received even more public interest than the first paper, because as an economist, of course, I think I should be modeling, I should be showing things with data, I should have a proper set of equations with which I'm demonstrating what I'm doing. I have 72 sectoral models that I'm all running simultaneously in R, right? And then this paper is just me reading a bunch of earnings calls, talking to my eye, like, hi, how could we do some basic descriptive statistics on this? I feel like there's a big story, and me reading some history of economic thought, the literature on administrative pricing, and some of the imperfect competition literature, and feeling like, oh, if I'm reading this together with the earnings calls, like somehow it starts to make sense. Like, okay, I should be putting this out as a conceptual paper that is just trying to make a little contribution in the current inflation debate. Yeah. Yeah. Are you hiding the coin-powered horse under your desk? Yeah. So, in the end, this paper really did get an overwhelming response. It has been in the Financial Times 5 times, including on the front page. I just did a second interview with NPR. I've been doing interviews with Wall Street Journal and so on. I mean, it's like been exploding in all sorts of languages across the world. I hear even in Israel, some people have picked it up, which is, of course, very humbling. And I'm very interested in people's reactions. So the question that we are addressing here is, why can large firms hike prices in an emergency? So if you think back to the chart that I showed you about China, right? It's pretty obvious that in a setting where each of these production units is basically a socialist production unit that is not behaving like a capitalist firm, that these guys would be passing on prices. Okay, fine. Like, we know about Kornai's soft budget constraint. We know about the different behavior of firms in a socialist setup. But why would it be the case that firms in a capitalist economy would start to be passing on price increases in the same way, rather than reacting to this by primarily substituting and adjusting their production decisions? To be more precise, some people have been arguing that the current inflation is a simple result of corporate concentration. But I would hold against this that, I mean, we have had incredibly high levels of corporate concentration before the pandemic, and we have had very low and stable prices before the pandemic. So how can corporate concentration be the thing that explains stable or even declining prices, and also explain prices that are shooting up, right? Which I think is possible to explain, but it's not obvious. It's not just in the structure of sectors. It requires more than that. This is a quote from the earnings calls that I've been reading that kind of stuck with me, which is why I put it in front of the paper. A couple of recent force majeure in the industry are making the pricing environment even more conducive. So what if large firms can actually use situations of emergencies as a pretext to increase prices in ways that allows them to not only pass on costs, but possibly to even increase profits? So I'm not going to go through all the details in the paper, but I just want to present the vision for the overall inflation process that we are trying to depict in the paper, where we are saying, yes, there has been a period of stability in which firms could only increase profit margins by decreasing costs because prices were pretty stable. Now, what decreased cost was outsourcing, globalization, and so on. So we actually have seen pretty dramatic decreases in costs in a lot of sectors, which is why we also have seen a tendency for markups to go up, even though prices were stable. Then the first stage of the inflation process would be what I'm calling an impulse stage. But even though I'm kind of depicting this in this like separate type of way in this chart, I'm actually thinking of these stages to some degree as also as overlapping. So depicting them in such a clear-cut way is basically a heuristic to try to make sense, but not necessarily the full empirical story. So in this impulse stage, profit margins, profits, and prices start rising, including in systemically significant upstream sectors. So the sectors that were to the right on the horizontal axis in the graph that I showed you, which is in parts due to commodity upswing. So we have had like a big commodity cycle, which has to do, I think, with the fact that commodity producers drastically reduced their capacity during the shutdowns. So I think the oil industry in the US is a very salient example where you can see that they have shut down the highest cost oil extraction facilities, and then as demand went up, they did not reopen all of these facilities, which meant that prices went up very dramatically, and profit margins went up even more because costs had gone down because the high-cost facilities had been shut down. But also there have been proper bottlenecks, as for example in the case of shipping, which allowed firms to basically increase prices in a way which I'm thinking of as a form of temporary monopoly, where these bottlenecks constrain supply in a ways that give firms temporary market power in a way in which they would not have market power if they were facing a situation where all competitors were in charge of their global production networks that are just in time, where everything is literally at the next click for the consumer. At the second stage then, these initial impulses in these important sectors are propagated and in some cases even amplified throughout the system. I'm going to come to why I'm thinking this is happening in more detail on the next slide, which then in the third stage resides in a conflict, as prices have generally gone up and wages were not, unlike in a inflation that is in the first place wage-driven, right, where wages go up and then prices go up and then maybe you are on par or something. In this case, prices go up, profits go up for some industries, but also profit margins go up for the economy as a whole in stage 1 and 2. And then in stage 3, labor basically reacts and tries to regain some of the lost ground, where, for example, in Europe you had a decrease in, in Germany, for example, you had a decrease in real wages of around 5%. And for the European economy as a whole, actually, it's a similar kind of ballpark. So you get a conflict as labor starts to react to this kind of inflation process. So the pricing principles that we are using to rationalize this amplification and propagation dynamic in our paper are basically threefold. The first one is that firms typically, in situations where they are price makers, which can be very large firms, but can also be small firms depending on the setting. So for example, if you're in one village where the next restaurant is very far away, then that restaurant in that village might also be a price maker, right? So if firms are price makers, I think they are, broadly speaking, behaving along similar lines as these principles, which is certainly not complete and not perfect and so on, but a first attempt of trying to capture this. So first, firms typically do not lower prices because if they lower prices in that kind of setup, so now don't think about the restaurant in the village, but think about a highly concentrated sector like the automobile sector, because it's easier to explain there. Like if one large car brand was to start lowering prices, then they risk entering a price war with their competitors, which is a destructive form of competition, which if one car manufacturer lowers prices, the other one reacts by lowering prices even more, and the third one lowers even more, then you get like kind of a race to the bottom, which firms try to prevent if they are in some sort of a contained kind of setting. Now you would say like, oh, but car prices did go down, right? Yeah, they did go down because there were competitors from Japan or Korea and so on, which were basically new companies in the market that did not have very large stakes in the market. So for them, destructive competition was not as dangerous as it would have been for General Motors or for Volkswagen. Prices can also go down when new innovative products come on the market, and then these older products kind of get driven out of the market, right? Like think of the last generation of iPhone, right? Like they might soften a little bit when the new iPhone comes to the market, that type of thing. But generally speaking, in these price-making situations, firms try to stick, firms that are already in a market, that are not new kids on the block, that are not creating new products to overrule old products, are trying to stick to the pack and not start price wars.
Maybe there were also a shortage of semiconductors and it affects...
Yes, I'm going to get to that, yes. Then the second one is that, yes, of course, there can be formal cartels, and we know that very well, and there can be norms of price leadership where it's basically always one firm starting to increase prices and the other firms following. But there can also be sector-wide shocks that can function as a coordinating mechanism that is some sort of an implicit agreement between firms, since all firms price in a way that is focused on protecting their profit margins, at least keeping them stable, because that's what they need to keep finance flowing into their corporation. That's what they need to maintain their position on the stock market, which means that they also know that all other competitors will try to keep their profit margins at least stable, which means that if there is a cost shock that is sector-wide, they will react by increasing prices because they expect other firms to also increase prices, and they would not lose market shares in ways in which they would lose market shares if they were to increase prices out of the blue. Now, to the computer chip shortage example, I would think of this as the third case. So if demand outstrips existing capacity by a wide margin, which can be the case because there's a supply shock, as in the case of a computer chip shortage, right, where suddenly supply shrinks because you just can't produce more cars than you have computer chips, or because demand suddenly shoots up. Think of stuff like hand disinfectants in the beginning of the pandemic, or in Western Massachusetts, also things like kayaks and canoes. In such a situation, firms can gain temporary monopoly power because they know that there's basically a queue in front of their shop, and there's a queue in front of the shop of their competitor. And if they increase prices, then the customer can go to the competitor, but the customer will just join the queue at the end at the competitor's shop. So basically, they have no way out, and because of this extreme imbalance, they can then increase prices even to increase profit margins, which means that with declining volumes, as in the case of the supply of the chip shortage, so volumes go down and prices go up, and prices keep going up, and volumes might actually keep going down. So you don't have the kind of supply adjustment to a price increase that you would expect in a simple kind of supply-demand model. So in other words, you have extremely inelastic supply in relationship to the demand levels. In the paper, we are going through some examples. I'm just going to very quickly walk you through this just to illustrate what I'm finding here. And these are just, this is not representative. These are company examples that we have been looking at, which is why I'm always emphasizing this is an exploratory study, trying to show something, that I think is a more general phenomenon, but based on selected small number of cases. So on the top chart, you see the volume in blue and the freight rates, which is basically the price, in orange, right? And you see how the prices explode, and after basically the third quarter of 2023, the volume is actually declining, but the prices keep going up, which results in this like enormous profit margin increase, which is the red line, and profit volume increase, which are the black bars. So you get like a profit price explosion in the shipping sector, which is, I think, a systemically important sector, even though it doesn't show up in our input-output model because of the ways in which sectors are cut in the input-output table. But in any case, I think it's fair to say that this is a systemically important sector, which then creates the kind of cost shock that I've been talking about. Similar with chemicals, where we actually see in the earnings calls that corporate leaders are very explicit in saying that they are using these supply disruptions to increase prices. So this is here a question from an analyst saying, do you think there's enough supply disruption due to Winter Storm Elliott, so this is not about the pandemic, but a different kind of emergency, to kind of rebalance the ethylene market and move higher from here, because this is a storm that particularly affects a production plant for that? And the answer from the representative of Dow Chemicals is, I think there has been enough, obviously, to give good momentum to these price increases in the first quarter. And so I think we will see the margins expand. So this is not just about compensating for fixed costs or whatever, but this is talking about this will give us an occasion to expand our margins. And this is just one example that I picked, but there are very many examples of that if you go through the earnings calls. As I mentioned earlier on one of the other questions. So he's even referring to another example within their own company. Okay, this is ExxonMobil, PepsiCo, and so on. Procter & Gamble is another interesting case because I'm not arguing that it's always necessarily the case that profit margins go up or profit volumes go up. Here we have a case where they have been going up mildly, but not as dramatically as in the case of Maersk or Exxon. But we again have a situation of declining volumes, increasing prices, and we have very confident statements on the earnings calls, things like, we are better positioned for dealing with an inflationary environment than we have ever been before, starting with a portfolio that is focused on daily use categories. So now we are entering the systemically significant stuff because it's essential for people's livelihoods, focused on, health, hygiene, and cleaning that are essential to the consumer versus discretionary categories, which in these environments are the first ones to lose focus from the consumer. So we see some companies actually specifically tailoring their portfolio in ways to be in the areas where demand is inelastic, because people cannot do without toothpaste, they cannot do without diapers, they can't do without laundry detergent, and so on. And now you may say, like, oh yeah, but does anyone need like a fancy Oral-B toothpaste? And then Procter & Gamble would say, like, oh, we actually also have the cheaper brand in our portfolio. So they have the whole quality ranges within one company, which means that you basically can't escape them, as they're, for example, saying very explicitly for the diaper case where they have the fancy diapers that have flowers on them and look very pretty, and the medium range diaper that can maybe absorb more liquid, and the lowest range diaper that, I don't know, makes your baby leak or whatever, but it's still a diaper. So even if you downgrade from one to the next, you will still be with Procter & Gamble. Okay, so as a result of all of this dynamic, we have seen an explosion in profit margins, and we have seen an inflation that where each of these black crosses would be such that the distribution between wages and profits would be equal, and it's been basically, for the most part, profit-driven. Which brings me to my conclusion, where I would say that if price shocks become systemic, because we are living in an age of overlapping emergencies, and it's not feasible to react with rate hikes and macroeconomic tightening each time a shock hits a systemically significant sector, then we need some sort of a new economic stabilization paradigm. So let's say, I mean, this time we started from a situation of very low interest rates, right? We have been hiking interest rates. We are already at the edge of a banking crisis, and for the European economies, at the edge of a recession. And now let's say on top of the pandemic, the war in Ukraine, we get a nice local major climate disaster, what are we going to do? Like, if in reaction to this kind of disaster, prices are going to shoot up again, will we react by continuing to hike up rates, or don't we need shock absorbers for the systemically significant sectors so that if shocks hit in these sectors, we can stabilize in a targeted way, not to push the economy as a whole over the edge, which I would actually think of as a less interventionist approach. So what I'm arguing is that we need a form of economic disaster preparedness to be able to absorb the shocks in these systemically significant sectors where they hit. This requires a change in mindset that acknowledges that inflation can result from microshocks. And in the first place, monetary capacity. So if you use the metaphor of a fire, where in 2021, Team Larry Summers was saying, let's flood the whole house because we have a fire in the kitchen, and Team Krugman Transitory was saying, don't worry, the fire will be off sooner or later, then I would have been saying, like, wouldn't it have been nice to have a fire alarm system? Wouldn't it have been marvelous to have a fire extinguisher in the kitchen? Wouldn't it have been marvelous if, on top of knowing that if the fire siren goes off, we know how to operate the fire extinguisher, and we put out the fire where it hits, instead of waiting for the whole house to be either on fire or to be flooded with water. So what could this mean? I think that this means new kinds of expertise, new kinds of monitoring capacity, and laws for emergency price management, where price management can, in all situations, only buy time for the kind of things that really afford you to rebalance the markets where they are suddenly unbalanced and where supply is suddenly falling short of demand in extreme kind of ways, but the supply adjustment is too slow because your harbor is blocked because you're in a pandemic, or your plywood demand shoots up because you're awaiting a hurricane, or your bottled water suddenly costs $25 because you're in a blizzard. These kind of scenarios, but then scaling them up to possibly even larger kinds of events. So if systemically significant sectors are so important that they can unsettle the whole economy, we might actually also need to reconsider the role of public and private stakeholders in these sectors. And this is now where I'm venturing into the territory of extremely controversial kind of questions, into the territory of post-neoliberal paradigms. And I'm saying central banks as the stabilizers of interest rates, a systemically significant price, were once private. Thank you very much.
Sit, or do you want to answer from here? It's up to you.
I can sit.
Okay, so here, you can sit. Here, no. That's for you.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Isabella. She only got here 2 days ago, and already the economic minister, I don't know if you saw this, Neil Balkat, said that he's considering price controls on Coca-Cola, so we're already feeling the effects of her talk. Questions we have about...
Perfect example for correlation not always being causation.
Okay. Oh, and we have a microphone for people, so just... yeah, just stand up maybe and...
Hi. One question. First of all, thank you. It was very, very interesting. I have one question about the first paper. How do you take into account changes in consumption habits and like, you know, the times are changing? How do I know that if I decide that oil companies are important, very important to inflation now, in 2 years maybe it will be something else? And how do you take this into account, if any? It's like, will it damage the model?
I think we're going to take about like 3 questions. Is that okay? We'll group them in 3s. Questions?
Hi. Thank you for an interesting lecture. One question. One word was missing in the presentation. It was expectations. What about inflation expectations?
Yeah.
Yeah, I should say I'm a central banker, so I apologize for that. What you gave an analogy about the banking system and systemic risk. In that case, I don't see any long-run neutrality of something and kind of a long-run anchor. But with inflation, expectations matter, and I think that dealing with crises, catastrophes, might justify price controls. But when you think about the long run, if you have anchored expectation, that should mitigate the effect of such supply-side shocks. Thank you.
Thank you, Tamal, and thank you for coming. Can we get maybe someone from the opposite gender? Maybe no,
no,
just
macro.
This is macro. No, it's gonna be a boys' club. All right. Okay.
Okay. So just one quick comment on what Itamar said. So clearly, if you have expectations, there would be a role for policy and inflation targeting, which is something that helps in this combination story. But I don't want to talk about it because this paper is very interesting and is putting in agenda different topics. So one first question would be a technical one in the first paper, whether you have looked at the input, output, import rates, which would be affected by the exchange rate. This is one question. And the second one on the policy, when you talk about policy, is the right way to react to do temporary price controls, or a combination of government policy, for example, like the government may reduce temporarily some tax rate on the specific products you were mentioning.
Thank you, which I think is what happened in Israel, right? Okay.
Okay. I'm really delighted to have central bankers here. Thank you so much for coming. So let me start right from the second part. We did not include imports in this story, in the sense that which is something that I actually skipped when I was talking about the model. So we have set some sectors exogenous because we, for example, don't believe that oil prices are simply a function of the input prices for, I don't know, steel and machinery and so on, but that oil prices are prices that are moving because of the fluctuations in the global market. So in that sense, they are part of our model when we shock them as a sector that is set exogenous and serves as an input, but we don't have them as a receiving sector in terms of the shock. The same with the import. So we have set, in this bare bone first version of the model, we have set the import sector exogenous. But there is, of course, pretty substantial literature that uses input-output models to look at the transmission of exchange rate shocks through, doing a similar kind of thing as what we are doing, but focusing on the exchange rate and the import side. So I think that this is, for example, a promising extension of what we have been trying to do here. But in this first bare bone model, we do not have that. We're actually now replicating this for Germany, and for Germany, of course, the energy price shock itself is to a large extent external, so we are starting to work out how to exactly model this for the German case. So the question of what should be the shock absorbers, thank you so much for asking this question, because I kind of rushed this part because I was looking around and people started to get tired, so it was time for me to move on and give everybody a chance to ask questions. So I am of the opinion that once we acknowledge that overall economic stability is not exclusively a macroeconomic issue, but it's also an issue of the stability of specific important sectors, then we are leaving the word of homogeneous aggregates and we are entering the messy word of sectoral specificities, of sector-specific institutions, sector-specific material realities where, let's say, the production time of cars is pretty different from even something as closely related as bicycles, right? So you enter a world where it suddenly really matters to have technical expertise on the technical and institutional specificities of the sectors that you are talking about. And I'm not claiming that I have that expertise for all the sectors that I am identifying as systemically important. So what I'm envisioning is to say we need shock absorbers for each of these sectors. How these shock absorbers look like will greatly depend on which sector we are talking about. So, for example, for oil, I think that the Strategic Petroleum Reserve in the US is a pretty good model that could possibly also be replicated in individual countries, or maybe even better, there might be scope for some degree of international cooperation, which I know sounds almost crazy saying this in the year 2023, but let's go back 4 years where we're all globalists. So I'm trying to be here someone who is saying resilience actually doesn't have to be nationalist. Resilience can involve global cooperation, and actually maybe if shocks are local and not geographically contained in some cases, international cooperation might actually make us more resilient than trying to bring everything close and home and right under the mattress of our own bed or something, right? So this is buffer stocks that are operating in similar ways as open market operations of central banks. I think could be an option for homogeneous goods such as oil, commodity markets where things are very homogeneous. But of course there are things where it's not as straightforward. Tax cuts, I think, can be an emergency measure in situations where states, because of how they have been set up, don't have any capacity to come up with any other kind of measure but tax cuts, which is something that they can do because they have the VAT and every state kind of knows how to manage a VAT, right? So it can be an element, but I am quite nervous about the effectiveness of tax cuts in an environment of price and profit hikes of the type that I have been illustrating, where we have seen food prices going up, not only because of the increase in prices on global markets for stuff like grain, but also because some very large food processing firms have been basically engaging in price gouging. And that's not me just saying this, but this is like major retailers in Germany, grocery chains, for example, starting to no longer buy products from Pepsi because they're saying, okay, these guys have been hiking up prices in ways that are unreasonable, right? So if this is the environment we live in, and then we say, okay, we are giving you a tax cut, I'm not sure if we can contain this with that measure. Which is why I think that in situations of emergency, where basically competition, which, I mean, that's why my first principle was firms don't tend to lower prices, but they actually also don't tend to hike prices if they expect other firms to not follow suit, right? They only hike prices if they expect their competitors to do the same. In which case you have a pretty strong competitive pressure, even in highly concentrated markets, which is why we have seen very stable prices, even in highly concentrated markets. But if this competitive pressure ceases to exist in situations of emergency, then maybe in situations of emergency we need some sort of an automatic windfall profit tax to take out that incentive for firms to engage in these kind of price hikes. So I would imagine that we have shock absorbers for the systemically significant stuff so that you don't get this cost shock as a coordinating mechanism in the first place. And then as a second layer of stabilization, you would have an automatic windfall profit tax that kicks in when you are in an environment where, I mean, CEOs are saying on earnings calls, the force majeure has given us a wonderful environment to hike prices and profits, then, I mean, okay, somehow this is not what we want, right? So we need some other kind of policy measure. Okay, this was a very long-winded answer, and I will try to be more concise moving forward. So on the expectation story, I would be really interested to discuss with the central bankers in the room. So my sense is that the expectation of the guys that I'm reading on the earnings calls are expectations that they take from the analysis of their consumers. And they are looking at how are consumers responding to the price hikes. And they are seeing that if there is a clear pretext which legitimizes the price hike towards consumers, then these consumers are actually more willing to pay these higher prices than they would have been otherwise. And they're expecting their competitors to raise their prices, and they're expecting tough questions from their analysts and investors who are saying things like, why aren't you guys hiking prices more? Because I have seen here, this is a fictitious example, earnings call with Pepsi Cola. This is not empirical. Hello, we have been seeing margins at Coca-Cola, and we are seeing Coca-Cola increasing margins, and you are not. Like, what's wrong with you? Actually, this is what happened with Walmart, for example. Walmart was penalized by the stock market for not engaging in margin increasing price hikes. So if this is the situation we are in, then I think expectations absolutely play a very important role, but it's the kind of immediate expectations involved in the observation of these companies, of their competitors, and of their buyers that, on my mind, are more important than the expectations of what the central bank may be doing. Which is not to say that the expectations towards the central bank doesn't matter, but that there is more immediate kinds of expectations that enter the equation in a very tangible, immediate kind of way. Then changes in consumption habits. So the model that we have is a super short-run model. So there's no substitution. Technological coefficients are all the same. So there's like basically zero elasticity of any kind of change in terms of consumption patterns or in terms of technology and so on, which is a limitation. But I think it's okay enough because we are making this assumption for all sectors equally, and the sectors that we get are the kind of sectors where I'm not so worried that people will stop consuming them. Maybe with the exception, I mean, food, housing, utilities, I think we don't need to discuss it. People don't entirely cut their consumption for that stuff. For petroleum products, you might say, like, okay, we have such a strong consumer preference that they now go into green stuff, where I would say, like, yeah, maybe, but I think at the end of the day, the driving force for structural change, such as a green transition, will be coming from capital allocation more than from individual consumer decisions. And the way in which capital is allocated is in response to profit margins. And what we have seen with the kind of crisis that we have been going through is that fossil fuel corporations have had the highest profits in their whole very long history, dating back to the late 19th century, which has resulted in a situation where it has become comparatively much less attractive to invest in renewables. And we have actually seen some of the major companies stepping back on their pledges for investments in renewables, which means that I think that this part of the story is not inconsistent with our kind of short-run assumption that we are making in that model that is about short-run, sharp, sudden shocks.
Thank you. Okay, we're going to do a quick round. Just ask short, Naomi, just please ask relatively short questions. We do want to keep you. It's already after 8.
So I'm going to ask, and your Germany project's not going to answer this yet, but from a perspective of a small, open economy like Israel, so you showed Procter and Gamble, right? Or was that, or I don't remember which one of it was, but like if the Israeli government would put price controls, right, on their products, they could say we're leaving. If we're talking about globalization, right? And so in the American case, maybe they can enforce it, but what would be like the price here, right, if we're dependent on these multinationals that actually are maybe more powerful than us? I'll just say it was really refreshing because a few months ago in the Israeli Economics Conference, there was a discussion of what happens now in this age of inflation, and the whole stage really agreed unanimously that we really don't need wage hikes now. We've been waiting with wage negotiations. Also, the academics in the room are really aware of that now. But like that, all unions should sort of chill because of the inflationary powers, and we don't. So it's nice to hear like a alternative thinking of what we could do without, you know, depressing wages.
I wanted to go back to wages because I understood it the opposite way. Because if inflation is a sectorial issue and a micro phenomenon, then that means that we should really freeze wages, in a sense. And that is depressing news. Because even if we try to avoid the macro perspective, the fact that the cost of living is rising means that we have to compensate wages, unless the real meaning of what happened is that real wages should go down. And and that is some bad news, I think.
Aria, you'll get the last question.
Thank you very much for this intriguing lecture. I'm talking as a historian of central banks. And I can tell you, in Israel, your story is, in the 60s, the 70s, this is what they do. And I buy completely your economic argument. I want to take you to the political aspect of your suggestion. I mean, what does it say about the position of the central bank, the interaction between the government and the central bank? I mean, who is going to take care of this initiative? Because on the one hand, if we give it this power to the central banks, it makes it a powerful, super powerful organization, basically an economic planner. And then if we give it to the government, we face with a problem. I mean, we don't know if they do it, if we will achieve what we want to achieve with this kind of control. And we see it currently in Israel, that the government wants to scrap the independence of the central bank, and not in order to pay more money to the workers and stuff like that. So in a way, and it's not, it's like I'm thinking with you, okay? It's not like a criticism or anything. And what I think is that in a way, if we go that way, basically we need to change all the economic regime. All the, because if we, basically it means that we want to move to a more planned economy. So we need, an agency that has a lot of, you need to have a lot of information about what is going on in the economy. And I'm not saying it's bad, but basically it's a kind of revolution. I mean, you can't change only the way the central bank behave. You need to change the whole system in a way, I think.
We used to have these experts.
I know.
It's not a revolution.
Okay, some brief, relative, but take your time if you want to really. Brief, but take your time.
Some easy questions.
Yeah, I know. Real softball questions.
Yeah, so he had
here
30 seconds to plan for the revolution, which is not even supposed to be a revolution. Okay, so the small open economy question, I don't have a good answer on it. I think it's an important question. I think it's in the realm of questions that we have, would need to be worked out. But I want to point out that I think the whole power dimension is kind of one of the dimensions that needs to be taken into account if one does a proper sectoral analysis. And the power relationship of a country like Israel might be very different in something like Procter & Gamble compared to Dates. I don't know, this is not a great example, I'm sorry, but just to say. Okay, then I think in terms of the next question, so I am not saying that inflation is a micro phenomenon, but that, inflation continues to be a macro outcome in the sense that the whole price level changes, but that this macro outcome can have micro origins. So in that sense, I wouldn't necessarily be calling it a micro phenomenon. Just to be sure that I'm not being misunderstood here. Now, the really important question of what's going on with wages. So I am absolutely not of the opinion that therefore wages should not be adjusted, but I am of the opinion that in the current situation where before the inflation, we were already in an age of extreme inequalities where someone like Piketty could become world famous because the inequality crisis is so severe that the most liberal constituencies would have to engage with this, because it's just such an in-your-face kind of real-world phenomenon that it's no longer kind of a fringe socialist position or whatever, but it's in your face. Now, if in this kind of situation we have a profit explosion and we have a collapse of real wages, I think not adjusting wages is not an option. Now, the question is, if we are now in this like third stage of the inflation, which I am calling the conflict inflation stage, not because there hasn't been conflict before, but because at this stage, like, the conflict is kind of breaking out, which I think is what we are seeing with the greedflation argument, and you might have noticed that I did not use that term, but nevertheless, with the greedflation argument kind of making headline news and so on, which I think is like a sign of that this is starting to become really politically loaded. So if this is the case, I think we do need nominal wage adjustments, but the question is, how can we prevent firms from not using the nominal wage adjustments as another kind of cost shock that is coordinating price hikes in the same way as an energy price shock coordinated price hikes? Why do I think it's possible for firms to absorb wage increases without being in big trouble? I mean, overall, on average, we have seen profit margins shoot up, right? So there is some scope for territory to be reclaimed. B, we are seeing energy prices, raw material prices, transportation costs, and so on coming down, which means, and this is something that I'm again learning from earnings calls, where CEOs are saying, even if we keep prices stable now, with all these costs coming down, our margins will actually go up again, which means that there is some scope to, I mean, if one chunk of your input costs is coming down, I think there's some scope to absorb a wage cost increase. The big question is, how can you come up with some sort of an intertemporal agreement that is like, okay, if you are allowing for wage increases now, then we are pledging to not ask for very high wage increases again in case you are not reacting to these wage increases with very large price increases, which is something that I think in corporatist settings like Germany is probably realistic. I don't know about the Israeli situation. In situations where this is not realistic, I think you need wage adjustments, wage increases, that is, and then combined with this, a windfall profit tax, which would prevent you from having a situation where wages going up, other costs going down, prices going up again because wages have just gone up, which would be a setup for a second round of inflation and a second round of windfall profits, which I think has to be prevented rather than preventing a regaining of real wages rather than, I mean, we are not talking about increases of real wages, we are talking about regaining lost territory.
And just the last, briefly, the politics of. Well, we know who's gonna do it. Isabella's gonna do it.
Well, I mean, so in that regard, I actually am like learning from the Chinese reforms, where I think there are things that are possible within the existing system. So, for example, and I keep talking about the German case because this is the one that I've worked on, so I have the best institutional understanding. So, for example, in Germany, we have a pretty large Bundesbank that has a lot of technocratic expertise and not too much central bank responsibility anymore. These people are actually watching price movements, right? They are composing their own projections of where the CPI is moving and so on. If they had a mandate that would say, if some of these very important prices are going up in unusual kind of ways, please inform the Ministry of Economic Affairs or inform the Ministry of Agriculture, whatever it may be. You would have a monitoring capacity that you already have in your system, but you would not yet have a shock absorber, right? So this would be like the lightest version of this. I think it would still be better than not having this, because if I look at the case of Germany, the gas price shock, like the whole recognition that this is even a problem took until September 2022. prices had already been at extraordinary heights in late 2021. So if we had a political recognition that these prices shooting up is a problem, even if we don't have a solution yet, but we have a mandate to the government that if this is happening, it's a problem, please come up with something to do to make this be less terrible. I think that would already be a first step. And then, of course, we can take this into revolutionary kind of versions, but I think they can be extremely reformist, in fact, very much within the system kind of approach.
Okay, well,
Can I have one final comment?
Sure.
I take a very strong lesson from your talk, that the struggle for peace, both in Ukraine and in Israel-Palestine, is crucial also to reduce economic deficiencies and inequalities.
Can I respond to this?
Yeah, of course,
I strongly agree with this. And I actually think, I mean, this is about, of course, about Ukraine. This is about, I mean, Israel. This is about the actual situations of, like, open conflict. I think it's also about the relationships of the West with China, because if this continues to deteriorate in the ways in which it has been, I mean, then the inflation we have been seeing might have been cued, right? Because then we get the kind of structural inflation. All the cost decreases of the last 20 years might be reversed, which then, I mean, then we are really in trouble, which is why I think that getting out of inflation in some sense requires some sort of a escape route from an escalation spiral.
Okay, well, that was very important. Thank you for making that. Thank you all for coming.